Welcome to Real PropTech, the conference about the transformation of the real estate industry.
Working? There we go. That's working perfectly. Thank you. I'm very much aware that I'm probably the last person between you and some beer, and I know how important that is. So I will try to keep my comments relatively brief. A little bit about me. You've heard a very brief introduction. Fundamentally, basically, I'm a geographer. I'm interested in the world around us and trying to describe why it is the shape that it is, like all geographers. And by happy coincidence, that seemingly is something that's become more and more important in terms of the technology and how we look at society today. And specifically, I want to talk about how that's important for Google and other sorts of IT platform companies and the impact that is going to have on the physical world around us. Because we think a lot in terms of Google and Facebook and Microsoft. We think in terms of the cyber world. But actually, increasingly, the access to information is changing the physical environment and how we look at the physical environment as well. Here are Larry and Sergey, the founders of Google, in their garage in Palo Alto. It seems if you want to have a successful company, it helps if you start in a garage. Microsoft, Facebook, Hewlett-Packard. So just hire a garage is probably your first starting point. And one of the original, and it is still the vision statement for Google, was this one: to organize the world's information, to make it universally accessible and useful. And that still is, as I said, the vision statement. And that fundamentally is the problem of our age. We are creating more and more information, and it's more and more difficult to find the information that is useful and relevant to us at any particular point in time or at any particular location. And the location bit leads on to why Google is interested in geography. Google is interested in geography because of this. This is the first law of geography. It was invented or created by Waldo Tobler, a great academic who unfortunately passed away last year. And he says everything is related to everything else, but near things are more related than distant things. And that really just means that by nature, we're more interested in things that are close to us than things that are further away. And that's as relevant when you're searching for information on the internet. You're probably going to be more interested in things that are close to you than distant. And a lot of effort goes on behind the scenes, in effect, for Google to turn the whole of the internet into a geographical database, into a map. So we know where the information is related to, what's it related to, and increasingly importantly, where are you in that map? So we can join the two together. But let's zoom out a bit and look at some big trends that I think are going to be relevant and relate back to this idea of connecting our world to the cyberspace world, these future trends. The first one is an obvious one, big data. And when I talk about big data, I'm not talking about the collection of more and more data and its storage. That just happens naturally. Databases are going to get bigger and bigger. We're going to create more and more information as we live our lives. When I talk about big data, I'm saying, are we actually using that data in an analytical sense to make different decisions? Not just collecting data for the sake of it, but actually collecting data that helps us make decisions, to do things differently. And that's something that we all have to be quite honest about when we talk about big data. Are we really using the information and based on that information, changing behavior, doing things differently? And it's actually that changing behavior part, actually making decisions, is the most difficult piece. Buying more memory, buying bigger servers is relatively straightforward. Changing business processes, changing how individuals live their lives as a result of having data is much more complex. Clearly related to what we're most interested in terms of PropTech is this move from a relatively suburban lifestyle, which has been certainly the case in the United States, to a much more urban, much more dense way of living. For sustainability reasons, that's a trend that is just going to increase more and more. But if you think about much of the technology that we take for granted today, that developed in suburban America. It developed in Silicon Valley. It developed in places where people drove. They drove to their work. They drove to school. They drove to the shopping mall. That's going to be very different in a future, much denser urban environment. And of course, we live in an age of digital natives, people that have grown up being online, having a smartphone in their pocket, instantly being able to connect to their friends, instantly being able to connect to information, and using that tool in their pocket as a mechanism for getting things done, for booking tickets, for identifying where they can get the cheapest deal for a concert, whatever. There's an expectation in this community that they will be able to get access to the information that they require immediately and simply. And that means, in many cases, doing major process automation to change existing processes to meet the needs of this very demanding community. So let's focus then on this idea of smart cities. And I want to focus in on what I think are the important building blocks that allow us to make smart cities. Smart cities is unfortunately one of those marketing terms that gets thrown around a lot and doesn't necessarily mean very much. What I want to focus on, and you heard that in the introduction, is people. I think too often we think in terms of big infrastructure projects and developments in terms of planning and so on, but actually what makes a city are the people that live in it. And we need to focus, particularly from the point of view of online products and services, on the people themselves and how they act and the information that they want, because, as I said, it's the people that make a city, not the buildings. And what I want to focus in on is initially some work that another part of the Alphabet family of companies related to Google, Sidewalk Labs, have been doing. Sidewalk Labs you've probably heard of. They've been working in Toronto trying to redevelop part of the city centre. And they're taking an approach that is, as I said, focused very much on people, being people-centric, trying to understand, from an IT perspective, what are the user requirements for a city? And that's quite a radical idea. We don't usually think in terms of user requirements when we're building a city. We do in terms of software, but in terms of building a city, that's not something we do. What's the minimal viable product for a city? What's the smallest thing you can get away with that makes some sort of progress along building something more complicated? Clearly, the thing that's going to be most different is the fact that the future cities are going to be networked, this idea of the Internet of Things. Sensors, information connected to each other, citizens connected to each other, being able to communicate in real time. And at a simple level, this means that actually when we build buildings, recognizing the fact that those buildings should be networked, either wirelessly or wired. The new building that I work in London is like many office buildings, a steel-framed building, which means that it's a Faraday cage, so you get very poor wireless signals in it. That's something that we need to change. The cities need to be sustainable. We need to be able to think about how we get products and raw materials in and out of those cities as simply as possible. We can't just necessarily use traditional road networks to do that. Maybe we have different networks for use for different types of utilities. Have specific roads, specific routes for moving goods, and other routes for moving people. And think in terms of efficiency. We're looking much more at building materials, looking at using wood rather than steel to build buildings again. So going back, perhaps, historically. And the area that I really want to focus on, because it's most related to what I'm interested in, is this idea of mobility and mobility as a service. How do we move around cities where we use information as a basic infrastructure for designing those mobility solutions? And what makes that different to perhaps what we've done in the past is this idea that I like to term ambient location. An ambient location fundamentally means the ability to always know where we are, but to also know where everything else around us is at the same time. So it's almost as if we have a radar that contains everybody moving around, and we can view that, not necessarily at a personal level, I want to make very clear, but in a sense of how the city is interacting, the nervous city the nervous system of the city in real time, and how that is changing based upon the characteristics of what's going on. It's driven by things like, obviously, Google Maps. Google Maps is a product that literally 1 billion people use every day. And Google Maps is a product that is built on this idea of ambient location because it uses other users' information as they're moving around the city to make the product better. You're familiar with that little blue dot that flashes when you're using Google Maps that represents your location. If you choose to, you can contribute your location and information about how you're moving about to the cloud so that other users can make the most of that information. And those other users contribute information about how they're traveling, how they're moving around in real time or in very near real time. And it allows us to build up this network effect. And a network effect works when more people are connected, the value of that network increases. And it gives us the situational superpowers that we're now used to. So I can look at a city like Berlin and in real time understand the traffic conditions from all of this information that is being sensed and contributed. I can also plug into official sources of information to find out about roadworks and so on. But that is, a view of the world that is being updated every 10 seconds or so, that is a reflection of actually what's going on. And I can route people differently across the city based on that knowledge. And it works at a different scale as well. This is the local pub that I like to frequent in London. It's my local. Pubs are very important to British society. And it's nice most of the time, but sometimes it can get really busy, particularly if there's a sporting event on. They have big screens that drop down and loads of people will come and they watch the football or rugby or whatever. And I never know whether there's a sporting event on or not. But if I look in Google Maps, I can slide up the information about the particular pub and it will give me a graph telling me how busy the pub is now compared to what it is normally. And that, again, is based on that sensor data of people actually moving around. And you could look at that for any public building anywhere in pretty much any city now, and you have that sense of, well, how busy is it compared to normal? And that same sort of information I can apply to mobile transport as well. So I can look at a particular bus that's going along in a route. In this case, this is some experiments we were doing in Sydney, and tell me how busy the bus is, whether I can stop, not necessarily get on that bus and get the next one perhaps. But it's that sense of knowing what's going on around the rest of the world in real time. And increasingly this information is much more personalized. We have these devices in our homes now that plug into our calendar that can tell us if we need to leave work early or tell us what the weather forecast is. This personal information is very powerful, but it is something that we need to be able to control ourselves and have mechanisms to do that simply. So if you don't pick up anything else from my talk today, go and visit this website. It tells you all the information that Google has about you. If you've logged in, it'll have all the information that Google has about you, and you can edit that, change it, make deletions, choose not to show or choose not to have some information shared with Google, so you have complete control over it. But that control, as I said, is important because once you have this personal data and you're willing to share it with an organization like Google or another platform provider, you can get different information presented to you. Here's some driving directions that are telling me, without me asking, how long it's going to take me to get to work, because it knows where I am, it knows where my work is, it knows the driving conditions. Or if I'm using public transport, it can tell me how long it's going to take me to get to work based on the current status of that railway network in this case. And it could prompt me to leave earlier if there were issues on the network. So it's taking that location data, that ambient location data and the personalized information, overlaying it to give me a sense of what's going on around me. And it's amazing what the impact of just presenting information to someone is. This is an interesting piece of research that was done that suggested people perceive networks, public transport networks, to be working better when information is provided to them. Even though there's actually no change in the underlying efficiency of the network, if you make information available, people perceive the network to be working better. If you want people to use public transport as opposed to using their own cars, getting this information to them is really, really important. Okay, the next big topic, of course, I'm going to talk about is machine learning and the increase in usefulness of machine learning. We probably all use machine learning now. If you use one of the personal assistants, Siri or the Google Assistant, the voice interface is using machine learning at a simple level. But I've got a much better example of what I mean by machine learning. This is the thermostat that I have at home that I control the central heating to my home. And it's connected to the internet, as you would expect. So I can pull out my phone and I can change the temperature. I can switch the heating on and off. And well, that's an example of the Internet of Things. And I could program my thermostat to switch the heating on at a particular time in the evening and switch it off at another time and set a temperature how I like it. Well, that's a rules-based system. Where machine learning comes in is my thermostat monitors how I change my temperature. When I get home, what temperature I set, how I might set my temperature compared to the ambient temperature outside, or what time do I turn the heating on at the weekend compared to during the week, and then automatically build a profile of how I like to heat my home, and then automatically take control. And that's what machine learning does, and that's what this thermostat does. Over time, it builds up an understanding, it builds up a recognition of the pattern that I like in terms of heating my home, and then that's what it does. And it's intelligent in that it can pick up, because it's got proximity sensors and it's talking to my phone, it knows if I'm home or not, and it can switch the heating on differently. And perhaps most sophisticatedly, it knows when I'm starting to travel home, starting on my commute, and will automatically start heating my home when it knows I'm starting my journey. If I'm late, there's no point starting to heat the home up if I'm not going to be there. Again, that's connecting all of these things together. And that, I think, is a pattern that we will see emerging more and more. The obvious example of where this is heading is in terms of autonomous vehicles. Here's a Waymo cab. I was just in California last week, and these are now driving around. You can hail them using an app, and it will offer you basically a taxi service. There is still a driver. That's for safety reasons. And there's arguments going on in the United States now of whether cars still need driving wheels. But it's pretty much completely autonomous even now and operational in a few states in the US. I won't show you this video, we'll move on. A thing that's going to make the biggest difference is this number. 95% represents the amount of time a car that we own spends parked not being used. 95% of the time. So you spend an awful lot of money on your car. Perhaps it's the second biggest purchase after your house. But the car that you spend all that money on spends most of its time not doing anything. That just can't make any sense from an economical point of view, and certainly from a sustainability point of view. So we definitely see the end of individual car ownership, much more moving towards cars, vehicles on demand, where you actually just take a service and say, okay, I need to get from here to my hotel. I'll get an autonomous car, come and drive me, and that's it. You don't worry about owning a car because no one owns a car. And if no one owns a car, you don't need car parks anymore because the cars are continually in use, serving the need that they have. If you don't need car parks, that changes the very physical shape of cities. Most cities today, much of the landscape is dedicated to cars, garages, wide roads, and so on. That might disappear if we don't have individual cars anymore. I'm just going to flick through these because I'm running a bit out of time and get to this idea of the great indoors. Now, what I mean by the great indoors is this. There are complex environments that we often have to navigate through, and Google Maps is very good at getting me from, say, here to the airport, or getting from me here to the main train station. But then once I get inside that train station, everything that I've been familiar with in terms of the services stop working. Because as soon as you go inside the building, we don't necessarily have good maps and we can't locate you. We do some efforts. Here we are at a big railway station, and I can identify roughly where I am. That blue dot is there, and I can see a map of roughly where I am. But it's not perfect. And there's a lot of research and work now going into improving this. And the reason we're doing it is because we live in increasingly complex buildings. This is the new Google office we're building in London. It's got a lovely park on the roof. But it's very big and very complex. Another new Google office we're building in Mountain View. It looks fantastic on the outside. But then when you go inside, it looks something like this. And if you've got an office, you'll be familiar with office plans like this. Loads and loads of desks. And it's really hard to work your way where you're going between all of these kind of complex buildings. So what we're trying to do is to build a new service that will allow us to navigate inside buildings. And the thing that we need to solve is the fundamental problem about where are you? Because when you're inside a building, traditional GPS doesn't work anymore. The signal doesn't get through the roof. But there is a technological innovation that will help us. And that's the next generation of Wi-Fi. It's called RTT, or real-time trip location. And it means that your Wi-Fi hotspot, and there's probably one somewhere in this room providing us with Wi-Fi signals, works exactly like a GPS transmitter. It sends a time signal along with a Wi-Fi signal, which we can use to triangulate your location very precisely inside a building. And it will allow us to be able to identify where you are in a building to about 1 meter accuracy, which is enough for us to then be able to navigate you through that building, through that space, in the same way that we do outside. And that, I think, is going to bring up lots of interesting applications. All of those kind of new technologies that we're familiar with in terms of navigating outside and the analytics of how we move around those spaces, we can start to do inside as well. Perhaps not that relevant for residential properties, but it's certainly going to be really big in terms of retail and in stations and large spaces that we interact with. And it means, I guess, that the scale at which we work in changes. No longer are we thinking in terms of tens, hundreds, kilometers. We're thinking in terms of those impacts that are in that much closer environment to us. That's what we've become more interested in. And let me finish off with just a final thought. And I think it's an important one, even though it might not be particularly relevant to actually what we do on a day-to-day basis. I'm going to show you a video. This is Cora. Cora is a semi-autonomous, electric-powered flying car. In effect, it's being tested at the moment in New Zealand. And it's semi-autonomous to the extent that you don't need a private pilot's license to operate it. If you can use a car, you can fly one of these things. And the idea is that if you're doing sort of point-to-point, commuting, this could be potentially much quicker than a traditional car or a helicopter or so on. Now you might say, well, okay, how realistic is that? Maybe not so. But what it is inspirational. It's inspirational because it brings together all of those technologies that we're talking about and radically challenges the status quo. It says, well, what if we combine all of these crazy technologies that already exist and produced a new product or a service from it? We've already said that maybe we won't own cars. Well, the thing that might replace cars might be flying taxis. But it's important, I think, to provide an inspirational idea like this, particularly to the younger generations that are coming through, those digital natives who, by their very nature, will want to challenge the status quo, will want to do things differently. And for the sustainability of any industry, I think is really important to provide those ideas, those moonshots of thinking to people. So even though, yes, we may not ever build one of these, by thinking about these sorts of problems, it opens our eyes up to different possibilities that are perhaps a bit more realistic. And now we can all go and have a beer. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Ed. Thanks a lot for taking us on this journey. Please feel free to ask questions via the Talk app or Slido, as you've done all day long. Let me ask you, at the moment I can go from door to door. So how long will it be until I can go literally from this stage, and let's say I know my office is in the office building at Alexanderplatz, 30th floor, and I have marked that very desk as my home. How long until I really calculate the route and I know the elevator is stuck, so it's going to take me 5 minutes extra?
I'd say probably between 18 months and 2 years.
So that's pretty soon.
So pretty soon. I mean, part of
And do you get there by your own technology or by partnering with other PropTechs?
A lot of it is, the actual issue isn't the fundamental technology. We got those building blocks. It's much more to do with the societal issues of actually indoors is always a private space, and actually wanting to share that information about internal office layouts and building plans. That's actually the biggest challenge, is what's the mechanism for doing that?
Is it easier to tackle that challenge in the private space, like private homes, or in office buildings where a company...
It's probably going to be a little bit of both. And I think, a lot of the technology that actually we can see developing now actually is being driven by consumers. It's being driven by the things that we buy, the Google Homes, the Amazon Echoes. And it's that sort of technology that's kind of really driving forward. The corporate world is in many ways a bit more conservative, much slower to adopt these technologies.
Should the PropTech industry be scared of Google moving in?
No, not at all. It's, if you asked Google what's your view on PropTech, they'd say, well, what's PropTech? It's not something that Google is going to come charging into. Although clearly we're interested in many of the fundamental technologies that are involved in the PropTech industry, but. No, there's no direct play. Obviously, we're always interested in investment. If you've got any good ideas, any companies that are quite exciting, come and have a chat.
So anybody looking for VC money, here's the big check.
I'm your guy,
yes.
yeah.
Thanks a lot for joining us, Ed. I hope you stay around.
Thank you very much.